Hello, we're right at the top of the hour, and I'm Dr. Kristalyn Shefflin, and welcome to an Applied History seminar. We are talking with Dr. Autumn Quesada Grant today, who has a PhD in Latin American history from the University of Mississippi and is an associate professor at Roger Williams University. She also volunteers heavily with asylum seekers. I'll turn everything over to Dr. Grant.
Hello. I want to thank Dr. Sheffield for the invitation, as well as the University of Southern Indiana, for, I should say, Assistant Dean Kristalyn Sheffield, for the invitation. So I understand the series is about applied history, and what I do is actually very much applied history, and it's applied history in ways in which you don't really think about. And what I do is really a very niche thing, and I'll explain what I do and also how I am able to use it in the classroom and bring students into this subject. So I began doing this work about 7 years ago, and the reason why I got into work with it is because I just happened to have been having lunch one day here in Bristol with a friend of mine up from Virginia, who's an anthropologist. And we were talking about the amount of travel, I was doing in Latin America. And so she suggested that I start becoming what's called a country conditions expert. And so it took me a little while to figure out what that was, but I did. And generally speaking, those who do this work tend to only work on one or two countries and maybe one specific issue or another specific issue. I, however, work on 10 countries and all issues in those 10 Latin American countries. And the reason why I say those countries is because often the Department of Homeland Security, the prosecutor, will always ask if I've been in that country and when was the last time I've been in that country. Even though the University of California, they have a law school that's the Center of Refugee and Health Studies. They say that people with a PhD in Latin American history, does not matter if they go to the country, are able to be credible witnesses. That being said, I have been in those countries, and so I can tell the judge that I've been there, that I've seen the communities, and I know what I'm talking about. So that's how I got into this, and it started pretty slowly, and then it began to gain momentum during the Trump administration, and is now, well, the courts were closed during COVID. And now that the courts are open, there are many asylum applications. So if we can assess this, so there's two ways that people come into the United States. They either come into the United States undocumented, what you would call illegal, going over the Rio Bravo, or many different ways, or they come in legally. So along the southern border, there are 330 border calls. So you can actually go into the United States officially and declare that you want an asylum. And the process is that you then sit down with an asylum officer, and they decide at that point if your story is credible. If your story is credible, then they'll let you into the United States for a short period of time. And in that time that you would need to find a lawyer, et cetera, and then set up going to court with your story. The tragic thing is that those protocols only work through about 6 to 10 people a day. And so you must understand that there are tens of thousands of people sitting on the other side in Mexico, because Mexico has allowed those people to stay in time for them to go through the border call. So what you do see is pretty much tent cities everywhere along the border, and it's also sort of a strange situation. It's a strained situation because these people are in Mexico illegally as well. And so they cannot work legally. So the question is, how do these people live in that area? So that is one thing that should be investigated. And so what we see at the southern border are not just Mexicans. We see an enormous amount of people coming from Central America. Right now, we're seeing a lot of people coming from Peru, Venezuela, and Colombia. As well as African nations have come over to South America, and they lived for quite a while, and they were allowed to live and work in Chile. Now they cannot do that. So you see a lot of people from different African nations also at the border. And this also doesn't include, I haven't yet included Haiti. Haiti is a completely different discussion. Before, Haitians had temporary protection in the United States. Now they do not, based on Biden's previous decision. So as the work that I do, so what I do is an attorney will contact me. My name is actually on a database with the University of California and on several other databases. It lists the countries that I work on. It lists the topics and the specifics of things that I can work on. And people will either call me directly because it has my phone line, or they will email me. And generally the first thing I do is I ask them what the dates of the deadlines are. I ask them what date is court, and then I ask them what is your draft due date. So everything for me really relies on what the court date and time is, because I can't have class and court at the same time, obviously. So I work around that. But luckily, a lot of things have worked out because I've done about 400 cases. 400 over 7 years. Each case runs close to 30 pages. So it takes a while to sit down and do the writing alone. Before you do that, you also have to do a tremendous amount of research. So I want to explain why it is that it's more beneficial for an attorney to have a historian do this kind of work as opposed to an anthropologist. Now, don't get me wrong, there are many anthropologists that do this work, but there's a difference in methodology that I believe really makes a historian a very good source. So as far as I go, I can talk about these nations in that I study them as a PhD. And as we worked through moving to the end of the PhD, we had to do a tremendous amount of reading. So I already started out with a really strong foundation of understanding of history of these countries, cultural practices, laws, etc., from the colonial period into the national period. So I have that background information. Anthropologists generally don't. So anthropologists generally work on what is happening right now, whereas I can connect something that happened 30 to 40, 50 years ago to what is happening right now, which is actually very true. I have worked on many cases where something that happened 40 years ago, for instance, during the Guatemalan Civil War, is an issue today, and is why children whose parents barely made it through that Civil War, the children of them are fleeing for their lives because of something that happened that long ago. The other thing I have to work with the judges to get them to understand that Latin America and the way in which Latin Americans think is a bit different than the United States, especially in terms of memory, as well as time. So when we talk about memory and time, we have to have the judge, and as well as the prosecutor, DHS, understand that Americans have a really short expansion of memory, right? So we can think about last week. We can think about last week, we can think about last year, but not much further than that. Whereas in Latin America, it is different. So that's sort of a basic thing. And that concept of time is really interesting for the attorneys because it's not something that they thought about in terms of how they're going to argue this case. And so generally speaking, there are 5 ways that you can ask for asylum, things like discrimination, political issues, as well as gender violence, as well as, and one of them was having to do with gang and cartel violence. And so what we do is we may take, for instance, let's say there's a case coming out of Nicaragua, and Nicaragua is very important right now. Actually, a case coming out of Nicaragua, it will always be primarily a political case, but depending on the story of the person, there may be tangential arguments that can be made, like for instance, sexual abuse, being tortured, of course, those sorts of things. So we argue a great deal of these topics in the document. So I write about 30 pages, which will then go with the attorney's brief. Oftentimes the attorney's brief uses what I have written in their brief. Now, an attorney's brief usually is talking about the laws, the language, things like social visibility, but also precedent, showing cases that have given precedent as to why the judge should give in our favor. Beyond that, the lawyer at times needs to be informed of other issues. For instance, things like civil wars, recent civil wars, or if we talk about Peru, we talk about a dictatorship from 1990 to 2000. That's right, 2000. And also, for instance, I did a case where in Peru, where the family was indigenous and they had been attacked by Shining Path. And so that harkens back to the 1980s or even before. And the father of the girl left about 1992. So that opens a completely different story. So if the daughter, it is now 2023, if the daughter in 2021 is asking for asylum based on the fact that she's indigenous, is and was discriminated against, the only way a judge can understand that is if he or she has the context of what is going on. And this is where the historian comes in, because the attorney does not know, generally speaking, does not know any of these histories. If we imagine there are about 150 countries in the world, an immigration attorney cannot be an expert on every single country they work on, which is why they seek out a country conditions expert. And then I would say that towards the end of the Trump administration, you could just turn in a declaration. I could write the declaration. And when I write a declaration, what I mean is I start with the client's story, what happened, and then I begin to interweave it into national history, always continuing with the story of the asylum seeker. And then so go from the nation down to what's happening in the department or happened in the department. Department is the same thing as a state, down to the municipality, and even sometimes down to their village. I can find out information about this. So with that being said, I have a lot of knowledge about what happened in the past. So therefore, then I can understand what is happening today. And that is something that the attorney does not know at all. And I have to figure out a way to explain that to the court. And sometimes it's very difficult because the court is very resistant. They don't want to hear a lot of information. They just want me to answer yes or no, which is a bit frustrating and whatnot. But if the attorney knows this information, they can talk about it in court. So those declarations that I write are very long, very long. About 7 pages of that declaration is just why I should be considered an expert on the topic. So I have to essentially write out my entire CV for them. So as I mentioned, I've worked on close to 400 cases or somewhere around there. And I would say the first few cases that I worked on, the courts would just ask for the declaration. But within the last 5 years, it is not only is it absolutely necessary that an attorney goes to court with a country conditions expert, but also within the 4 or 5 years now, I have to go to court and testify. So I have a lot of experience. We do it on Zoom like this, a lot of experience testifying in court. Now, one thing that a country conditions expert cannot not do, ever do, is to show bias. Even though clearly there may be some bias there, right? When you hear a really bad story. But I have to be unbiased. And where that unbiased comes from initially is when I first read the client's story. And it matches up to other stories that I have read or histories that I know. If I think that that story is not credible, then I will not take that case. And I'm not entirely sure what happens. If I do think it's credible and then that it's real, then I will. And at that point, me and the lawyer begin to work very, very closely. So there are other experts in the court, say, for instance, a psychologist, mental health person who gives a document saying, yes, this person is bipolar, etc., or has a medical condition. I work very, very closely with the attorney in order to craft an argument and for us to decide what is going to be the asylum claims. So one of those 5 claims, and under one of those claims is called particular social group, and we call it PSGs. And I find often that we are looking at these PSGs, and that gets down to very specific things having to do. Now, as soon as Biden came to the presidency, he was able to reverse a little bit of Trump's work during his administration. Things like during the Trump administration, out of the 5 reasons that you can ask for asylum, he got rid of 2. Those 2 were domestic violence and gang or cartel violence, that you're running from gang or cartel violence. Biden came into the administration. During the Trump administration, how I got around the domestic violence discussion is I was a little sneaky in my wording. And so I started to use gender violence. So that's a larger word that could include domestic violence, but it can also include, say, transgender, transvestite, all of these sort of other issues that would fall into that bucket of gender violence. When Biden became president, he reversed that decision, so we can now argue for domestic violence. But he did keep the last one, and the last one is actually the most important one and the one that we see the most, and that is running from a gang, like in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, or cartel violence. So in these years, I have learned a lot about every cartel in Mexico. How do I know all of this? I have read books by journalists who have worked on it, and I also read the newspapers. I need to know, this is an issue here. Historians tend to look back in time, say maybe 150 years ago or 300 years ago. I have to look to yesterday or last week, month, et cetera, right? I need to do that. And what the AHA calls that is to be a presentist. So technically, I'm a modern historian, but I've even specialized into becoming a presentist, because usually in history, we don't take newspapers at the moment as a credible source, but I have to do that in order to know what happened yesterday. So we have a lot of cartel violence, and it is extreme. absolutely extreme. And we also have gang violence coming out of El Salvador with the MS-13 and their opponent, Barrio 18. And they're very frightening. And right now, I'm also working on a new giant gang that is becoming a cartel between Colombia, and it kind of sits between Colombia, Peru, and Brazil. So there's always work to do. So to bring this around here to the student, for instance, what I do, you have to have a PhD in that particular area. Specifically, you should have been to that country several times. But what a student can do doing this work is you can either intern for someone like myself, helping with the research and you getting intern credit, or I just did a class at UMass Dartmouth, and it was a friend who does cases as well. She was trying to teach her students how to actually do the translations, because one of the things that attorneys do is that they send us translations of the declaration of the client. Since I speak Spanish, I usually tell them they don't need to do that. We can hurry this process up, but that happens a lot. So students can work, who do and are fluent in another language, can do this work. And that is helping. And I would say the last thing that a student could do is to get involved with what I call development work. So get involved with NGOs, local NGOs in your area, or say large NGOs like rapists along the Texas-Mexican border, etc. You can get involved with them. And that actually could lead to a job, especially as we begin to think, what can you do with a history degree? Of course, you can go to graduate school. You can work in a museum. You could be a docent. You can all sorts of things like that. Very traditional things. Teaching a community about their history, all valuable. But now, as the university life is changing, especially for the humanities, we have to think outside the box and how it is that we can be important outside the box. And for me personally, I came to realize about 7 years ago that I had all this knowledge about Latin America, not only that I had been taught, but what I was seeing on the ground. And I wanted it to matter. I wanted it to use it to help change people's lives, or actually save people's lives. So like I said, I've worked on over 400 cases, been in testimony. And so I have seen a lot of this. And I think I'll wrap it up at that. That's sort of a nutshell of what it is that I do. So if there's any questions that you may have about this work.
So you're more than welcome to write your questions in the chat or raise your hand and I can unmute you. I had a question though, thinking about this in the longue durée, as we are often taught as historians, is this an Indigenous women's problem?
Yes, that's an enormous one. That's actually one I've argued fairly recently. Mexico, Guatemala, and Peru is where I really see Indigenous gender violence. We see that. I was talking today, it was a male for Peru, but he was Indigenous. And I was having to explain to the judge why it is that Indigenous peoples are very vulnerable. Because one thing I forgot to say is that the attorney has read the US Constitution. The attorney knows all US laws, but they do not know Mexican laws. They do not know, they haven't read the Mexican Constitution. I have read all of those constitutions and I have been able to see loopholes. So for instance, to your question, a lot of these countries, when they use the language of discrimination or violence, they don't go into the specifics of either Indigenous or women. So I look for these loopholes that the attorney can then bring into and argue in court. Yeah, so it is, and I cannot underscore the impact of violence against Indigenous women is enormous. Not only is it from gangs, it's also familial. It's from their fathers, it's from their brothers, it's from a neighbor, sometimes it's from a gang member. There's so many. They're so vulnerable because the state, this is the last thing I'll say on this.
Mhm.
The state, you can read their constitutions. Like if you read the Guatemalan Constitution, there is no language of Indigenous people, and there absolutely is no language of protecting Indigenous people. And truly, there are two Guatemalans, one to the north in the highlands, Indigenous, that has about 22 languages, and then the Mestizo side. And they completely ignore the Indigenous side.
So we have a question from the chat. Have you ever seen people in these cases misinterpret history or try to weaponize it against asylum seekers?
When you say who are you meaning?
So, the question is people in the cases, so I'm going to assume that they're asking about the attorneys or the judge who are deliberately misinterpreting or maybe even misunderstanding the history, or utilizing the history of violence in that region to weaponize it against the asylum seekers or to cast aspersions upon them.
Exactly. The answer to that is yes. It's not their attorney. Their attorney does not weaponize it. People on the ground do. The reason why the people have fled, the women or the children have fled, is because of violence, specific violence against women. And a good word that we use is femicide, right? So a husband might kill his wife, and whatever, that might be domestic violence. But the intentional violence that thus ends up in killing women, whether they're Indigenous or not, is femicide. And generally speaking, the Constitution also does not hold any protections for these women. So there's that. So, well, let me finish that thought. A big problem that not just applies to women, but it really applies to everyone, is these countries that we're dealing with, especially in Central America and the southern part, the northern part of South America, is, I talk about this often, is the normalization of violence. So and it happens in Mexico as well, but there is really the concept of normalization of violence because they had just come out of a civil war. And so they're used to, especially in terms of gangs and whatnot, they're used to that. The second part, as you say, and I'm actually going to tell you a very quick story that should shock you. So judges should go into court without bias and should hear the stories. And that's my role, to sway the judge to understand the realities of the violence. So therefore, then the prosecutor will weaponize the dangers and bring it back around and say it's their fault, which is the same thing that the government does. Say the Mexican government does it as well, comes right back. So there is a weaponization of this. Last part of this question, which should shock you, is I had a judge who was absolutely absolutely going to argue against and not grant asylum to a woman from El Salvador. He actually said in court, on record, that raping was okay. Yeah, he actually said it. He actually said some more things, but the one that made me actually react was that he said raping women was okay. Oh my, no, it's really true. I'm not making this up. He
No, I
also,
don't think you are. It's actually interrelated to the next question, the Q&A. And, I would actually add it to, cultures of machismo, and that longer history. But, you know, cultures of machismo, and the question in the Q&A is, do you think media framing is another reason we are desensitized to violence against Black and brown women?
yes, I think there is, how do we do this? The media, number one, I would say, is bias. We know that. The media also can be xenophobic, and the media also can just look for the most exciting issue that they can grab on in that moment. And in terms of not people of color, not brown and people of color, but in terms of asylum seekers, Latinos, they, like Trump had said, these are going to be racist, these are going to be gang members, these are going to be bad men. And they do. Gang members are here. MS-13 is everywhere. But those have gotten across undocumented. So it is the media. Well, I also like to say is the media uses two things, sensational thing. They'll, like, recently they showed a video of people running to the gates of the southern border, and they took that snap in order to, like, say, wow, something's happening on the border, we should pay attention. Or the famous photo of the father and the daughter who had drowned face first. The daughter was like 5 years old in the Rio Grande, right? That were trying to cross because they couldn't get legally into the country. So yes, very much the media sensationalizes it, because I really think it's because they're ignorant.
Absolutely. Another question from the Q&A, and to tag on to that, where and when did this function of historians assisting lawyers in this manner begin?
I think it has been around, I really can't tell you when it started. I did meet a guy that has done over 1,000 cases, so maybe he's worked on it about a decade, but it's been going on at least the last decade. As attorneys find that it's more difficult for them to have someone assigned asylum when they don't understand the country. So definitely by now, and I would say definitely by the time I got involved in this, an attorney must have a country conditions expert, and that will help them. And that expert, like I said, it's not just like someone who drops in like a psychologist. No, we work hand in hand crafting the document that I'm going to put into the court, and that they're going to put in the court, and they're going to align.
So for those who are interested, who may not understand, we know that folks are fleeing violence, but can you speak a little bit more to the journey that they're taking alongside the coyotes, and what are they experiencing as they are seeking to even get close to here?
Okay. This is a complicated question, but I will very much simplify it. But I may also say something that is very shocking. Okay. So once someone crosses the border in Tapachula in the state of Chiapas, they will be paying a coyote, and all coyotes today are controlled by the cartels. And a whole nother story could be like, who's the most powerful cartel in Mexico, right? So, but those coyotes are going to be the ones that are going to traffic them up to Mexico City, hand them off to another coyote, and they then are going to take different routes in order to get to the border. Now, as we can guess, of course, people are going to walk through the desert, right? And they have one jug of water to walk in the desert for 4 days, and they're not going to survive. I use fictional novels in some of my classes just to soften the issue a bit of people who just die. There's just the desert is just riddled with bodies, but that's not the worst. the worst is that a cartel the coyote will hand you over to a cartel, a local area of the cartel. And what they will do is ask for ransom of the person, so they will get part of the ransom from the United States for the person, and will continue with the discussion of ransom. But the fact of the matter is they have already killed that person. So specifically, for instance, the state of Veracruz is described as one big mass grave. So in one case that I was working on, there was a mass grave, and there were 144 people in that mass grave. And if you're thinking they're coming from all different nations, who are they? They are people who have a story, which I do want to mention at the end, that I think is very important. Yeah. So the trip is, whether you're on La Bestia, on the train, or if you're walking, it is very, very, very dangerous especially as you get closer to the north.
So interrelated to a question in the chat, why do you think the media portrays violence the way that they do? Is there a purpose for the way that they portray it? And why isn't it more well known exactly what we're just talking about with the cartels and the coyotes and the experiences that people are fleeing from and desperate to get away from, so desperate that they would place themselves into the hands of
they would rather die on the way rather than staying home.
Yeah. So what do you think about how the media is portraying this, or why isn't this more well known outside of specialists?
Well, let's flip the question and start with the first. The first would be that most Americans do not know anything about the Western Hemisphere, about the countries that are at their back door. And I think that is purposeful. And that is because the United States has interfered many, many, many times in these countries. And so they keep people ignorant of those histories. And especially if you're studying history, American history, the turn of the century, cartoons that the media uses in the newspapers and whatnot will use really racist sort of depictions of the people south of us. Now and so therefore it just sort of stays out of our mind that we're not there. So we don't know, we can't feel the violence that is happening, which is unimaginable. So I always ask the question, what's the difference between an asylum seeker and a refugee? They're the same thing. But it has to do with what looks good for the government. Allowing Syrian refugees in or Somalian refugees in is politically beneficial to them. They look like the beacon of democracy. In Latin America, we don't see that. Daniel Ortega, Nicaragua, again, I say as important. Daniel Ortega recently did something similar, and the American public has fallen for it. Nicaragua is now an authoritarian state. But one thing that he did, which is actually very similar to something that Fidel Castro did in the 80s, is Ortega had he has two major prisons, and he had these people in these prisons. And so what he did was he took the most dissident people, the most outspoken people, and there was 200. This was in the news, and he said, look, I'll release all of these people here into the United States as a good humanitarian issue. And the United States was like, yes, we're going to save their lives and whatnot. The truth of the matter is freedom of speech is outlawed in Nicaragua. So he wanted to that's not the only thing that's outlawed, but freedom of speech is outlawed in Nicaragua. So he wanted to take the most vocal people, which were our authors, journalists, human rights activists, this sort of thing. So it wasn't just the average person on that plane. It was the ones that would actually get the information out about what's going on in Nicaragua. So he sent them to the United States. And the whole story was like, the United States. Look, we're taking these people in without actually thinking about what's going on in Nicaragua.
So I think we have time for one more question if there's another question out there. What, in your opinion, is the biggest misconception the general American public has concerning immigration and asylum seekers?
Let's see. Well, I would say the obvious, that they're all rapists. That, well, you know what Donald Trump had said, President Trump had said that they're all criminals and rapists. When in fact, this is not the truth at all. Some gang members who have slipped through, like MS-13, have slipped through, but a vast majority of people that come to the border are trying to flee tremendous violence. And when I talk about violence, you cannot imagine the type of violence that I read, have to read. Every time I read a court declaration and I think that's the worst thing that I could see, another one comes along and it's worse. It's not even a word, worser. It comes along. Yeah. So I think there's that misperception that these are all bad people. And I think that's been going on the whole century. I know this may be our last question, but I do want to bring up this idea. And this is something that I've noticed as I do this work. I suffer from secondary trauma all the time because there's only so much terror and horror that one can read, research, and write about, because these are actual human beings. It's not a novel. And I've actually been thinking fairly recently about the moments of trauma that the people who are asking for asylum go through. And thus far, I've come up between 6 and 7 different traumas.
It brings up an incredible point, especially to consider as historians and especially as people who are going to be teaching and talking about these topics. When we think about trauma and we utilize it within the classroom, what are some safeguards to couch these conversations in a way in which it is not exploitive, or in a way that it's not harming the students within the classroom?
That's a good question, because I've taught 2 classes that were directly focused on the work that I do, couching them in sort of this discussion of human rights. And how do you make the students a little uncomfortable, but not a whole lot uncomfortable? The way to do that is to tell them, this particular chapter that we're about to read is going to go over some very difficult subject that you may not want to read about. So you can skip that chapter. I have had one time in a class, we had just read, it was actually a book on Pablo Escobar. So it was something that happened a long time ago. So we read about something tremendously horrible that a cartel did, Pablo's cartel did. And the student came up to me at the end of the class and he said, "Is it okay if I run out of class and vomit?" And he had every reason to feel that way after what we read. So after that happened is when I kind of kicked in and started to think that maybe this stuff is common to me, but it's not common for them. I can make them aware of these things, but I don't have to go into too much detail about what is the worst, right? So yes, I warned the kids before.
Absolutely. Well, we want to thank you for joining us today. And if you are interested in learning more about these topics, what would you recommend students read?
Oh, I have a whole flurry of books, quite frankly. So if they're interested, yeah, because there's some really great, and I would say brave journalism coming out of these areas. Because a lot of times the cartels just shoot them, kill them. I was in court, just very quickly. Today I was in court for Peru, and I was talking about a major gang that is very common, becoming very common in South America. And the prosecutor asked me if I had interviewed someone from that gang and asked me why I had not interviewed the person for the game. And what I said was, I don't want to die. As simple as that, right? So if a student wants to learn more, you can always get in touch with me, and I can have a bibliography of things that are, I hate to say it, exciting, but also eye-opening about this subject. Also, I don't know if your school would let you do this, but I take interns all the time and help them where they get class credit, for instance, and that would help them out a lot. Yeah. So if you want that, I'm
Absolutely.
open to that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and I know there's a lot of these students on the chat who are going to be in my colonial Latin America class in the fall. So it is sadly all interconnected with one another.
It is.
So if you do have that bibliography, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll post that on our applied history webpage, as well as your contact info, so that if folks have questions they'd like to ask offline, they'd be happy to interconnect with you.
Sure. All right. Thank you for the invite. Okay. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Take
All right.
care.
Bye.